Hello, everyone. I'm your podcast host, Brent Van Conant, bringing you another in our series of recordings focused on practical advances in soil health for Western Canadian farmers. These recordings are part of a larger soil health initiative coordinated by Assiniboine College, bringing together a network of many Western Canadian grower groups and other organizations to continue to advance soil health in ways that accommodate the unique circumstances of each farm. This podcast and the overall soil initiative are made possible through the generous support of the Weston Family Foundation. If you like what you are seeing and hearing, tell a friend and feel free to check out our website, soilhealthnetwork.ca, to find out more about our soil health project. Thanks for joining us. In the continuing series of our podcasts around soil health, one way or another, many of you would have bumped into David. He's been around pretty relentlessly for a long time, dealing with lots of things that are critical to our industry. Um, I had a chance to dig through your resume, David.
Mm.
I got about a page in and I started to get tired. I'm thinking, I'm not sure how it is that you launch a successful grain farm operation from no money and no family help into 6,000 acres over your career. And in the meantime, have this enterprise that grows into across Western Canada to build field agricultural field research enterprise that provides advanced research for and capabilities for industry and government and transition that. And by the way, in the middle of all that is what I think is kind of an unbelievable number of projects that our conservation tillage productivity center and integrated ethanol plant that, by the way, you built yourself, and a hog barn that was finishing 15,000 hogs a year, and a private feed grains breeding company so you could figure out how to feed those hogs. Um, People talk about those things that there aren't many people who actually decide they're going to talk about it and do it and make it happen. And then, maybe you lost interest in that. So let's have a goat herd of 16 milking goats. Let's convert our farm to organic and then say, maybe it's a different version of organic. Let's try um, what you call zero till plus. And in my spare time, I'll write a book on the road to fossil free farming. And because I'm not busy enough as a grandfather, why don't I start a PhD program? And
Yeah.
which I understand you are currently just tweaking and imminently going to have completed. I'm tired talking about
Fingers crossed.
that. Fingers crossing. So, that's a lot of achievements in a lifetime, and those who know you, I had the privilege of calling a few of your colleagues, and
Mm.
in the description of how you go about those things, I found a lot of pretty common themes from seemingly fearless and relentless to explore and adopt ideas and practices that have the potential to be practical and reasonable on his own farm, but are also a test case for discovering solutions that could serve the entire industry and beyond. And don't let his relatively quiet voice and demeanor confuse you. He's fierce. He has a fierce determination to figure out and fix things about agriculture practices and policies that could change the world for the better. And he seemingly never backs down from a challenge without giving more personally and professionally than any should ever be expected from anyone. Uh,
Wow.
if you plan to work with David, be ready to be challenged by a flood of ideas and a commitment to purpose and endless energy. And if you Google lifelong learner or agent of change, you might just find David's picture. He reads, he asks questions, he thinks, he builds networks of academics and entrepreneurs and professionals to pursue his lofty goals. Does that sound like somebody you know?
Well, I think you got the wrong person. I admit, better go look for that guy.
I smiled as I heard all those things from your friends
Yeah,
because that seems reasonable to me. And
thank
in
you.
in this program, so much of what you've dedicated time and energy through right from the beginning of Zero Till Association involvement, a whole bunch of that has centered around soil health. And we just thought how fortunate for us to have you interested enough in what we're up to give us a little time for this conversation. I appreciate having you here today, David.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to it.
Um, the the initial times with the zero till folks, what was it about that work and about the potential of that work that must have completely grabbed your imagination because you've been running with it for another 30 years beyond that. What
Yeah,
got you here?
I grew up in Winnipeg, but I spent most of my weekends and summer holidays on my uncle's farm at Minto, and I I was on open tractors and doing summer follow, and I thought I was the king of the world then when I could, at 12 or 13 run a 50 horse John Deere 730 John Deere um, with a hand clutch, and just thought I was on top of the world. But I was black at the end of the day, and dirt would blow, and I think that somewhere I realized that that was not necessarily the best answer, and
Yeah.
um, and zero till just made sense. Like it mimics nature. It has its own deficiencies and problems, and I've faced a lot of those, but it's pretty foundational for what I think is the future of food production.
And what were the initial breakthroughs in that sort of set the path for kind of the current successes or the or
Yeah.
the or the current things that you're tweaking with?
Just before that, I guess most most of my successes relied on a fair amount of luck and ability to either see or make opportunities. And the luck was I had fairly good marks in university, and Dr. Elmer Stobie kind of screened the students for marks and potential grad students and invited them to be summer students. And I was lucky enough that he saw something in me, and I was a summer student for him, and then a grad student, and then actually a business partner for a very short time. But
Mm.
he was pretty instrumental in me being able to get involved with that zero till group really early on. So, what was the key things? Well, a lot of that can't couldn't happen until you had a herbicide that actually would be broad spectrum, and of course paraquat or sweep came on the market first, but it's pretty toxic chemistry to humans, and didn't work all that well. It was a burn off treatment. Then Roundup came along, but it was so expensive. Like it was, I think, $48 a liter when it first came out,
Yeah.
and guys, would try it a little bit, but the economics weren't that great. But the idea
Right.
was perfect. Then it came down to 24, and then 12, and then 6, and then 3, and then up to 6, and down to 4, and it
Mm.
become very economical.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, one thing I've learned in agriculture is the best treatments can become the worst treatments or obsolete because we depend on them so much. We use them too often.
You
We
don't
have
want to have to
leading
rely on them
diversity.
forever because that world doesn't work
Yeah,
that way.
yeah. And I've seen guys with, the perfect rotation. It was winter wheat and canola, winter wheat
Mm.
and canola, winter wheat and canola. And then, of course, it started to fall apart. And then they had to come up with something else. But so
Yeah.
we're in a bit of that. Well, we've always been in that predicament that as we do something and we do it too much, we find the negative externalities or the weaknesses, and then we have to keep evolving and inventing, and that's what zero till did.
Yeah.
They had a herbicide, and then they needed a drill, and they needed straw management, and they needed to diversify rotations, and between farmers and scientists, we figured that stuff out. And it's what is it, 90% of the land in Saskatchewan is now zero till. Like farmers wouldn't wouldn't be able to do what they're doing now without zero till.
And then the more efficient use of moisture and
Yep.
fuel and all kinds of things. Yeah. You,
Yeah.
if you've
Increased nitrogen use efficiencies.
Now you've kind of coined this phrase about zero till plus.
Yeah.
Um, we have lots of reason to celebrate the remarkable influence that zero reduced tillage has had and all
Yeah.
those benefits. What do you, to you, what is the plus? What are the next things beyond that initial breakthrough of minimum tillage? What's the next piece of contribution to soil health
Um,
that looks like it has potential on your farm or beyond?
yeah. Just before I answer that, Dr. Dave Franzen has recently retired. He's a soil scientist from North Dakota State University, and he found that if you zero till for 5 or 6 years on a heavier soil, you can reduce your nitrogen by 50 pounds per acre on wheat, which is quite astounding. So you build up soil organic matter, you build up biology. What also is really, really interesting, he was interviewed by a no-till farmer not that long ago, I think within the last year. And they asked him, what do you mean by zero till? And he said, certainly a single disc drill, minimum disturbance, that's right up there. A banding hoe drill like is more common in the prairies. It works too. But he also said, 100% sweep, but not more than 2 inches also will get you those nitrogen credits. So that gives us more flexibility than what I thought we actually had. And I think there needs to be some research done in that area to know how much is too much and how how little is too little. Because I suspect we're going to need alternatives other than herbicides every time. That we're going to have to diversify, and still we want to keep that microbial component, and keep improving soil health by minimizing disturbance.
So if I'm reading this right, there may be versions of strategic shallow tillage that keep virtually all of the benefits of what we considered were minimum till, but help us through some of the obstacles that we're still facing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think there's opportunity to expand our thinking in those areas, and hopefully expand what we would call zero till or low minimum disturbance on more acres than what we're currently doing. Saskatchewan's pretty much maxed out, but Manitoba's got a ways to go yet.
And when I look at your time sequence of that endless list of projects, somewhere in there you pursued an organic farm, and then you decided there was something worth trying there, and then something worth leaving behind there. Maybe talk a little bit um, about what you needed to prove to yourself going in and coming out of those pretty substantial production decisions. That that was not a small commitment to some
No.
big ideas, and you carried those to completion and then made a change again. I'm curious about what.
The reasons for going in that direction partly had to do with a little bit more of a perception of self-sufficiency. It sort of becomes tiresome to buy your seed before you've harvested your crop, uh, um, and all the inputs, and so we seem to be on a bit of a treadmill. And um, but I found organic farming has its own treadmill, so there's nothing where you're completely independent. If you want to have 40 acres and a big garden and a couple of goats or a cow, you can maybe do that. But if you're going to farm in any kind of modern way that your wife will still stay with you, That is,
That's a reasonable objective in my world. Yep.
yeah, but you might want to try to make these other practices work.
Mhm.
We could make a living with organic, um, but as I found out, um, the yields aren't just 10 or 20% lower. They're because you have to green manure and you lose um, a year out of two or a year out of three, your yields are actually substantially lower. And I know the earth doesn't have that many acres. Like if we all went no till, and one of the farmers that I interviewed in my PhD was only 25% of the yield of kind of his normal input neighbor. So we don't have four times as much land. So from an, I hate to say, um, ethical point of view, I don't think that's the direction we can afford to go. And there are places in the world that can where organic has a better niche than here, but in the where we're limited by soil moisture, tillage is kind of our enemy. Um, when I first started farming, I zero tilled a little bit, but I used the traditional cultivator and double disc press drill quite a bit. And every time I sowed, I kind of looked up in the sky and kind of wondered when it was going to rain and make me look like I knew what I was going to do or what I was doing.
Yeah, yeah,
And then, I was zero tilling everything and I forgot to do that or forgot that I needed to do that. Germination was pretty much guaranteed. Then I
yeah.
went organic farming and I was looking up at the sky all the time again, hoping that it might rain. And that sounds like it's going backwards.
Right.
um,
Gotcha.
and then our soil quality certainly wasn't increasing and our phosphorus was going down. And it
Yeah.
takes, uh, I think you can make that work. Um, I think you have to be cattle centric to make that work. And if you
Okay.
don't like cattle or don't shouldn't have cattle,
Yeah.
maybe I commend people that can make it work, and I think there's some farmers that are highly susceptible to some pesticides, and I think there's some consumers too. So it's nice
Yeah.
to have that choice, and then the rest of us can kind of watch what those guys do, and as we overutilize some of our other inputs, we may need to rely on some of the more agroecologically orientated practices that they use. So
Yeah.
there's kind of room in the sandbox for everyone. But if anybody thinks that organic farming is going to solve the problems in Western Canada, I don't think that's something I would support.
Just doesn't scale in the way that it needs to. And
No,
you, I'm guessing that there's elements of that that you learn something from that are part of your current strategy, and probably elements of what you see going on in versions of what they call regenerative agriculture that looks like they have some promise. Uh, what's your patchwork of the ideas that you're kind of pulling together from desperate fields to build your own strategy or to test some of those ideas currently?
yeah. Um, well, the agroecological solutions, when I was interviewing some of my farmers and asking them about their what I have this adoption tool I call BERT by E. If a best management practice or beneficial management practice is going to be used, it has to go through the lens of BERT. And B stands for beliefs. If you don't believe in the practice, you're not likely to do it. If it's not economical, you really can't do it or you won't be
Yeah,
farming long. R is regulatory. So if regulatory pushes you one way or the other, that's going to be a factor.
yep,
And that can be from government, but it's as we're going through some of the soil health and climate change stuff, it's also food companies and it's also financial institutions, and it's the root of that is consumers and shareholders and investors. Tea is a technology that you can actually use. So just because they can broadcast red clover on winter wheat in Ontario and actually have it grow doesn't mean we can do it here. And I've tried it, and it's a lot like taking my wallet out of my back pocket and taking the bills on a really windy day, throwing them up in the air and see what's happening. And if you do that two or three or times in a row on 12 quarters of land, you maybe I shouldn't pull my wallet out.
Ouch. Yeah.
So the other letter that belongs to Bert is a denominator, another E, and that's the energy of the farmer to physically and mentally make the change. The
Change.
change may be solid, uh, but he's up to his eyeballs in kids or debt or whatever the stress is, and he just can't do it on without perhaps some help. Um, Easier training, financial incentives, whatever it takes to kind of get him in that mind frame and with the energy to make the change, given that the change is something that would benefit him in the long term. So if you can put that through Bert, I think um, lots of people will be interested in the types of things that we're doing to improve soil health.
And what are the practices that you're currently grinding through this BERT equation
Yeah.
to discover whether they hold up or not?
Well, first of all, my neighbors may not think I'm doing anything that makes sense, but um, we keep trying things. I've gone pretty hard on trying to keep the ground or the soil with plants growing from snow to snow.
Okay.
And better management of my volunteers is kind of the cheapest way to do it. Sowing winter cereals for cash. I've done lots of that. But our ground is quite rolling, and quite often we kind of lose the hilltops from winter kill, and we flood out the low spots, and then we scratch our head of what to do with that in the spring. And there's some places where it's better suited for those things, and but we keep doing a little bit of that. Cover crops in the fall just do not work for me. My very astute wife suggests that if I think it's a good idea to get off the combine and go and seed, even winter wheat, never mind something that may or may not amount to anything, and certainly isn't going to provide more immediate cash the next year. She suggests I have seasonal seeding disorder, and she suggested ways to correct that problem, which I don't want to test her on. But I've come up with a really um, improbable solution, but a hopeful solution that we would, um, and we have a lab set up to do this, but we're starting to coat cover crop seed, and then we'd be able to sow it with our spring cash crop, and it would germinate, say, 80 days later when the crop is starting to senesce, leaves starting to fall, the sunlight can get to the ground, and if it rains, the seed would grow. And I think that would be a way to scale up cover crops in Western Canada. If we're going to increase soil organic matter, we, low disturbance is key. Getting more um, plant growth and for a longer period of time is also key. And that's a tough one. But I think if we really dig down and look for solutions rather than just relying on throwing that red clover on the winter wheat and watching it fail time after time, I think we might be able to get somewhere on that.
So
Nitrogen is, sorry,
what are the combinations of that delayed germination cover crop? Is that you see that in canola stubble and cereal stubble and soybean stubble and corn stubble, and does it make it through the frost, and is it there in the spring to be terminated, or is frost terminating? What are the permutations and
Yeah,
combinations of that you kind of think are most hopeful?
I guess I think if we can make that technology work, then all those options are viable.
Okay.
Um, there's a couple criteria. It's got to be relatively inexpensive. Um, um, Adding another tank or utilizing an existing tank that we have because of other technologies that free up that tank,
Yeah.
um, you know, that anybody can do that because they're doing it already and it doesn't cost them virtually anything more other than the seed.
Right.
Um, um, the trick with the technology isn't so much in getting it coated so it doesn't germinate. I think we could easily do that.
Yeah.
It's trying to figure out a mechanism to break that coating kind of on demand. And it could be a biological addition, like we coat the seed and then just before we put it in the ground, we coat it with a biological extract or a particular enzyme, or maybe even there's a that those would be what I would call biological clocks or a chemical clock. You know what happens when you put urea and ammonium nitrate together? It becomes soup.
Yeah.
So, slow acting two chemicals that, in 80 days they dissolve that coating.
Right.
I don't know of any of those at this point, but those are within the
And
thinking, right?
is um is it about is it do you I'm trying to think about when that cover crop ideally I'm certain there's some difficulties to getting the the coating off on exactly the day you want it to. So
Yeah,
there's some buffer to that. But if you could
yeah.
get it exactly when you want, um, like how much do you want established as the old crop senesces? Is it about moisture? Is it about N uptake? Is it um, to sort of get the
It,
optimum?
yeah, there'll be trade-offs. You know, certainly in the U.S. and a little bit here, and Dr. Entz at the University of Manitoba has done lots of work with trying to green seed, putting pulses into um, fall rye. I've done quite a bit of that, and moisture is a problem. Nitrogen, it could be a bit of an advantage actually if the rye kind of soaks up that nitrogen ahead of a pulse, um,
Hmm.
and then it forces it to nodulate more. And then as the rye breaks down, that nitrogen becomes more available later in the season and can kind of give it a boost, maybe along with that magical August rain that we need for soybeans. Yeah. Um,
I, it, like so far, almost every version of what we would think about for some kind of extended cover, um, it's always been you couldn't see it until the other crop was gone. So
yeah.
that when if you actually have the window about well, about when you establish it, if it's not at seeding and if it's not at harvest, and you can pick somewhere in between, I'm just wondering how robust is the research work to determine, where each cover would ideally
Yeah.
germinate, do its thing, and provide the least risk and the maximum benefit back to the grower.
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time perceiving how would we know?
Yeah, and it depends on the accuracy of it. Like if it worked really well and we could schedule it to start germinating August 25th, we sow winter wheat and fall rye with that. Um, if it's spread out over too long a period of time, it may not be as desirable to sow a cash crop with that technology. Um, yeah, there's a number of possibilities, but the, that's certainly going to be the challenge in this thing is to get it to break down at the right time. If we're just so we're starting with rye and hairy vetch and red clover and perennial ryegrass is kind of our target species, and we'll kind of see where it goes. And this isn't a project I really wanted to do. I like the idea, and I got a fortune cookie about 40 years ago, and it said an idea is not responsible for the people that believe in it. So
I,
I think this is a long, long shot, and it when I first thought of it, and to some degree it's not new at all, but it's been mostly used for a different purpose. And the purpose in the late 70s and 80s, going into the 90s, was to sow a spring crop in the fall with the coating, and then hope to sow it late enough that the coating wouldn't break down in the fall and let it
right.
germinate, and and then get it to grow quite early in the spring because normally the earlier you can get it in the ground the better. But
Mhm.
we don't have dependable winters or springs.
No.
Sometimes we get an early winter and you miss the opportunity to sow it all.
Yeah.
Or, I think it was 2000, I don't know, 19, or we had an early October snow, quite heavy, and then it melted, and then we had spring again, and then it froze up, and so that technology for that use just didn't work. And Ag Canada and lots of other people spent quite a few man hours working on it. So that's why I say this is not necessarily a cakewalk.
Yeah.
But when I
And
first thought it should be pursued, I went to Ag Canada and said, you guys are making promises for net zero and that sort of stuff. And if you want us to sow cover crops and improve soil health, then why don't you guys work on this? This is an Ag Canada sized project. And they didn't really seem to be able to help me. So I went to Bear. I happened to know the CEO a little bit, and I said, this you guys are making these suggestions of where we need to go. Um, so this is a bear-sized project. You could probably make some money with it and solve some problems. And the CEO said, "Yeah, I like your idea. You figure it out and then come back and see me." And I went to a couple of smaller companies and same answer. So
yeah.
after a couple of years of trying to get some resources together, we have a pretty good lab and some good staff, and we'll give it a go. But if somebody comes up with the technology before me, I'd be just happy as could be. Um,
But
but interesting, I was at Saskatoon at a meeting, the International Farm Management Congress, and met a guy from Kentucky, and he farmed 25,000 acres in Kentucky. Most of his product went into bourbon. The bourbon people really liked the idea of being green, and really wanted them to sow cover crops. And he did on 19,000 acres 2 years ago. And he said, I think it actually will pay. They don't really get winter. They can grow legumes right in the season. But he said it is such a pain in the ass to try to sow a second time in the year in the fall when everything else is happening. So even
yeah,
there, it's tough. And he said, and I mentioned delayed germination, and he knew exactly what I meant and why that might be interesting.
yeah.
And he said, have you thought of putting a ceramic coating on the seed? I said, no, I hadn't, but I don't think that's the answer. And he thought you could run over with a high frequency wave, like
Oh,
like
shoot.
the opera singer breaking the,
It shakes, break the glass. Yeah, there you go.
yeah, yeah. So I'm not pursuing that one
Fascinating.
at this point, at least.
So in addition to delayed seed uh, germination for whatever combination of potential cover crops or companion crops. What else do you see on the horizon that either you're experimenting with or you're watching really closely that has um, that has substantial soil health implications?
The one that I'm trialing with replicated trials in four different crops is adding biology at seeding time. And I'm in a soil health network to some degree put together by General Mills about 7 years ago. And there's fellows in the club that are just 100% convinced that these are making a tremendous difference on their farm. And I've done some pot studies and I can see a little bit of increase in root growth, or maybe actually substantial increase in root growth. But every time I put it in the field, I don't see a huge difference. So I'm hopeful that some of those things will work.
So,
Um,
what are the range of biologies that you're talking about? The
well,
biochar, bugs in a jug, or what? What?
well, this is more like the Eco Key type of products,
Okay.
or there's a Johnson Sue method, or Dr. Elaine Ingham from Portland, Oregon. And one of the farmers that I interviewed in my thesis has his own system, which is kind of a bit of everything. But from an inoculant point of view, he calls it IMOS, Indigenous Microorganism System. And he just goes to the most productive wild places on his farm and digs out a little bit of the biology out of the soil, or the soil with the biology, and collects that and makes that as inoculum. And then he has a system which is essentially based on Dr. Lane Ingham's work of multiplying that biology and using it as an extract or a seed coating. Um, it seemed to give us a little bit of a boost in yields this year. We also tried a vermiculture, and I think there's some hope for that. I was in Cuba a number of years ago on a farm tour, and there was a language barrier and a knowledge barrier on my part, but they had some pretty fantastic looking crops, and they don't have much access to nitrogen fertilizer. So I don't know if that's a good correlation or not, but they were using permaculture extracts and that sort of stuff. And there's some documentation of using from Cuba of using azotobacters to supply some of that nitrogen. And again, I couldn't decipher if the crops I was looking at had any of that stuff on them or not, but they were pretty nice crops.
Is there
Um,
is there something about how old the soils are, or how long somebody's been practicing there, that uh, some of the more tired soils may respond to some of those treatments more than I described to somebody that our soils here in Western Canada are still kind of teenagers as opposed to
yeah,
60-year-olds, and they bounce back pretty quick. They can survive on Red Bull and a
yeah.
couple hours sleep. A 60-year-olds can't. Is there kind of the equivalent in the experience with Western Canadian soils that they're they're still they're still pretty young?
And that might be part of the reason that I'm not seeing as much out of the biology as maybe some other people are. You're right. Our soils have very good soil organic matter relative to a lot of the soils around the world. I was in France a number of years ago and couldn't believe the deadness of their soils. It was just
Well,
the organic matter. They weren't black soils for sure. They were just kind of light brown, sandy. Just how can you grow anything there? I guess it's put enough rain on it that it grows. But so and if you get too sandy a soil, it's difficult to make huge changes with that without kind of good moisture. Um, but those, most of our silts and clay loams, if they've been degraded over time, probably respond better to that biology than my soils. And not that mine are great, but 4.5 to 5% soil organic matter, um, great water holding capabilities. We're just surprised some years the kind of yields that we get for the lack of rain. Um,
What would those soils have been 100 years ago at that sort of first breaking? Would they have been 7 or 8% or 10 or
I think in that 8 to 10%. Um, yeah, I think we're roughly half of what it would have been. So that means we have a lot of potential. And I read the literature, and some of it's a bit funny that they think we're going to saturate our soils in the next few years. Now, there's a program that was put forth at the Paris Accord called 4 in 1,000. So that's 0.4% per year increase in soil organic carbon. Now, if I did, uh, in my thesis, I wrote what my farm would look like in 2050 when my granddaughter's running it. And if she was able to maintain the 4 in 1,000, it would go from 4.5 to 4.8% from now to 2050, which is, good. But
up?
um, some guys are thinking that they're not 0.4%, but 4 and 5%. And I, that's, that would be nice. And then we might be able to saturate our soils. But most of the farmers that I interviewed were probably between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.4, which is quite respectable. Western Canada, there was a long 21-year study done by Dr. Brian McConkey, and probably his initial numbers were in that 0.15%. And then there's some more dedicated analysis of that that looked at um, essentially areas that had stopped summer following and continuous cropped and zero tilled and didn't kind of revert back. And I think they were closer to 0.2%, is which is another aspect about cover crops. I don't think cover crops should be put everywhere. I think the brown soil zone, they you can get that 0.2% in a dry, very moisture deficit area just by zero tilling and continuous cropping. If you add in cover crops and use up your moisture that you need for your cash crop, you're not going to be farming too long. So there may be niches where that can work, but I suspect that should not be our one of our targets.
Um, is there anything else on the horizon? We've been through um, cover cropping and ways of increasing organic matter, and what else gives you the sense of some promise of um,
Yeah,
close enough to achievable on a farm that we should be leaning in on the applied research or
yeah,
something that can help unwrap the riddle of improved
yeah.
soil health.
Um, this one isn't quite as orientated towards soil health. Hopefully, it's orientated a lot to our pocketbook. Companies have made strides towards net zero. An organization called Scientific Based Target Initiatives, and it takes helps organize companies make net zero by 2050 pledges. Um, when I first learned about it a couple of years ago, there was 3,500 companies that were making those pledges. When I checked last Sunday, it was 9,969 companies, including the largest food companies in the world. One of the things they want, there's two things that will get us to net zero. One is to put more carbon in the ground, which increases soil health, and the other is to reduce our emissions. Um, None of us can grow plants without nitrogen. That's pretty obvious. 4Rs can help us reduce some of the emissions, but it doesn't provide us an alternative for fossil fuel based nitrogen. But I came across some technology, and there's maybe before I get into the real holy grail, there's some options we can do right now. We can grow more legumes, and sometimes in order to do that, we need science to give us better disease control so that we have less root rot. So that's a real issue, and there's a real need there. We do have this phenomena of nitrogen credits for low till or zero till. I think we need to exploit that better. We have bugs in a jug, Invita, Nutricia, and there's a whole range of them, and there's lots of promises. And I'm hoping those are versions one, and they'll get on to version two and three that actually might be more reliable and get a better return on investment. Um, there's green anhydrous ammonia. Curtis Hebert from Burling has the first fuel positive on farm nitrogen anhydrous ammonia plants, and, and I think that's okay. But the holy grail really is having nitrogen fixing plants
Hmm.
that make their own. And in my thesis work, I didn't even mention it. We didn't discuss it, and my impression was that people have been working on this for years and nothing's happened. Dr.
Mhm.
Vesey at University of Manitoba, I'm told, spent 20 years doing this. And then just before Christmas, I started nosing around, like, where's the current technology in this? And um, actually, Lorianne Kaminsky pointed me in a direction, which I'm very thankful for. And there's this um, astute, bright, quiet soil science or um, what well got she knows microbiology or not microbiology. She knows biology, cell biology. She knows genetic manipulation. Um, and she's been working for the last probably 15 years on what was considered a very unlikely uh, method of getting nitrogen fixing plants. They've got patents and they're going to field next year with their first crop, which happens to be triticale. They picked it because it's not a big crop. They didn't want to start on wheat or canola. They picked something that was of relatively minor. But I'm really excited about that. That would change things in a hurry. What farmer couldn't justify stop buying nitrogen fertilizer and just changing their wheat variety instead, and saving that money. So I don't you know, I don't think that's as long a shot as delayed germination seed technology. They actually
Oh,
have it working.
if you
So
you
maybe they want to work on delayed germination seed technology and let me be free.
you have to sign the NDA for the clause. Well,
Yeah.
so what, uh, David? One of the things I appreciate about the way you address some of these problems, you've been clear about stating you want soil health for the farmers' reasons because you want it needs to make sense for them for productivity and a real economic model. Um, but it's not lost on you that the carbon equation is a bigger picture for the world and civilization to address, or there's going to be just continuing negative effects in weather and climate and other things. Um, how, what I guess what coaching do you give to the average producer who uh, they have their own enterprise and their own bills to pay and their own grandchildren that they're trying to get through university and an enterprise. And yeah, there's bigger problems than them. You occupy a lot of your personal time on things a lot grander than just the activities of your own farm. But, making sense of how far we can go as producers to solve problems that are bigger than just farm problems. Uh, when is that our responsibility, and when is that too much to ask of us? I, I, I think you've wrestled
Yeah,
with that, and I'm curious about your
yeah,
thought.
yeah. None of us can do this um, without keeping the farm afloat. Um, Philanthropical. I'm not very good with that word, but
Philanthropic?
um, yeah, that's we can only go so far with that, and it's not very far. Margins aren't that great, and that's why I brought up Bert. If it doesn't work with Bert, it's not going to work on your farm.
Yeah.
So we have to have these practical solutions that pay. In one statement in my thesis, I put it's not the farmer, it's the technology. We'll adapt stuff very quickly if you can show us that it works, not only for the world, which maybe we don't really care about because we do have these bills to pay and kids to look after and things to
Mhm.
do on the farm. Um, but zero till is one of these no regret um, net positive net zero BMPs.
Hmm.
But we don't think of it that way um, because it we can farm more land quicker with higher yields and better moisture use and less soil erosion. And by the way, it puts more carbon in the soil, which takes that out of the atmosphere. So we need more no regret BMPs. Um,
Right.
Another BMP is, um, I think, is going to solve it pretty quick is diesel fuel.
Hmm.
Um, as far as I know, and this election in the states may slow some of those things down, but Federated Co-op in Regina is putting up a plant that will produce 3 billion liters of not biodiesel but renewable diesel. It has the exact same standards as regular diesel. It's drop in; you wouldn't notice any difference at all. Um, and we can grow enough vegetable oil on 0.75% of 1% of our land to produce enough diesel fuel for 10 liters per acre, which in theory at least is enough for all the on-farm motive requirements on the farm, if not excluding shipping it off the farm. Um, so that to me is not a stretch, and it's not hydrogen, it's not anhydrous, it's not electric, it's not having to change any infrastructure on the farm at all. So why wouldn't we do that? And so
So was it what
it's not going to affect food
that
production.
was 3/4 of 1%, did you say?
Yeah, it's not much. You can do the math, but and that
We were
assumes, of course, that the meal is worth something, because then it would, depending on if it's soybeans or canola, the meal will make up a bigger or lesser part. But it works out either way to about 0.75%.
we have overlaps that are more than that, even with GPS systems. But I mean, it's that's kind of staggering that.
It is, yeah. Most people don't know. Um, but going back to your, what motivates me, or why do I how would I convince somebody that's not convincible about climate change? If they set aside, well, I wrote this book, and it's not the greatest book in the world, but it's kind of interesting and a little bit funny in places. But the first chapters I kind of introduced myself. Well, why the hell is this guy writing this book, and who is he? And then, then my logic of, I wouldn't say I was a denier, but I was not necessarily aware or taking into account that things are warming up. And then I looked at kind of three things that would kind of convince me. One is satellite images, like the glaciers are disappearing. um, you can see that over time. Things are warming up. Um, the scientific measurement, the changes in solar CO2, and it's been known since the 1800s that CO2 is a blanket around the Earth that keeps us about 15 degrees warmer um, than we would be otherwise, which would essentially mean we're frozen, most of us. um, and then I looked at, who is saying what, and I looked at the Pentagon. You said one of their top threats of the world is climate change. It's right up to the top, and they acknowledge that. I looked at what Shell and BP were saying in the early 80s, and they recognized that climate change was real and that needed to be attended to. They found out nobody really gave a damn, so they just kind of did business as usual. And then I'm not Catholic, but the Pope wrote a book called Encyclical of Climate Change and Inequality. And he said, God didn't make this problem. You guys did, and you should fix it.
Mm.
Yeah. And then lastly, insurance companies, if they're not making money and can't charge enough to give a return, they don't exist either. So insurance rates are going up, and the insurance companies are blaming a lot of it on climate change. Bigger wildfires, heavier rains, more floods. It, to me, it's obvious. On the other hand, in the short term, we're a little longer growing season, a little warmer, a little more moisture in Western Canada. We're the place to be. Um, Except that somebody's got to eat that stuff, right? Otherwise, we don't have a customer, and we don't farm anymore. So just because somebody in well, some of the floods in India, in Pakistan, they're just almost mind-boggling. Or the fires in Los Angeles right now. Look how much destruction.
Yeah.
Um, so how are our grandkids going to live in a world that's people are going to be fleeing those areas, moving up to where it's going to be better for longer, but not better forever. So how can we make it better forever? Um, that's kind of my ambition, and I want to make money while I'm doing it. So we have to be pragmatic. There's just no question about it. Um, but
Well,
you know,
I appreciate that you have both those lofty dreams and the pragmatism to be experimenting with different ideas, looking for the no regret technologies that do what we want for us and others. And thank goodness on those occasions when we find them. You've weaved your way through a career that brings a lot of pretty cool ideas together. I appreciate the time that you've had with us today to share some of those. I know I and many others will talk to you many times again, and we'll keep doing what we can to crack some of those nuts. But appreciate
well,
your persistent effort on our behalf and on our grandchildren's behalf. Thanks for your time
you're
today,
welcome.
Dave.
Thank you for inviting me.
Appreciate it.
Take care.